everyone, this is Roxabox90 here with another how to build an EDH deck video. Last time in the introduction we discussed how EDH differs from standard modern legacy decks, but I think it's important to kind of go more in the details because a lot of people, when they'll first sit down to build their EDH deck and they've never really done it before, they're going to run into the problem in that they won't think big enough. Lots of people have done this. I've had people trade with me for cards that they say, oh, I want to use this in EDH now. And it's just too small. It just doesn't work. So I think it's important that before we get to the picking your colors, picking your general, picking your cards, that we kind of establish quite a few important ideas. So the big one to focus on is the thinking big, which I discussed in the introductory video. You kind of have to get out of the X cards, X of each card, X of cards in a certain deck will make it mathematically viable and it'll work, because you don't really have that here. You're playing with opponents who have far more resources at hand, far more life, and you only have one of each card, except for the basic lands. So, some of the things that you have to consider. For example, number one, small non-utility creatures. This is talking about cards that are not useful outside of their own attacking someone. So for example, if you have a grizzly bear or a white knight, or you have a 2/2 for 2 that doesn't do anything else. The idea in standard and such, if you were using it, would be to play it out. It would attack, and then it would do damage. And hopefully you'd move on, and you'd either make it stronger or it would just die and you'd move on. EDH, you don't want to fill your spots in the deck, your very selective spots, with creatures like this that are basically useless. Remember, we're talking multiplayer. Some cards like this may be okay in 1v1, but we're not discussing that now. Multiplayer, running those sort of cards are awful. If you're going to run lots of small creatures, then you're probably going to be running it in tribal. You want creatures that when they work together, they have really big impact on the board. So you have cards like the goblins and elves, wizards, tokens. If you're going to have lots of smaller creatures around without much going on, you want them to synergize, to work together for a big effect. Another example would be if you're running, let's say in Modern, you're running a Goblin Guide in a mono-red aggro deck. So Goblin Guide is pretty useful in a deck that turn 1 can play him out and he starts attacking. In EDH, someone could take Goblin Guide 5 times and it wouldn't even slow their deck. So, especially if you're playing against multiple people, you can only attack one at a time. So you're going to want to pick small creatures that they're not just there for their combat abilities. They have to be able to do other things in helping your deck. And we'll obviously talk more about examples when we get to utility creatures in the deck building process. Another thing you have to think about is cards that have, unless they pay X, counterspells are a good one. Let's say Mana Leak. Mana Leak is unless they pay 3. In EDH, that's laughable. Most people will have enough lands untapped, enough mana in their mana pool to pay the cost over a couple times even, and laugh at you for your silliness of even running a counterspell like that. And this also includes like destroy X creatures unless they pay X, or any of those sort of things. Because in EDH, it's a wasted spot. There are huge mana bases. Almost every deck, even mono red decks, have big enough land bases and big enough mana pools that it's not a big deal. So if, for example, you want to run cards that do stuff, you don't want them to have this. You want things that are hard spells. So you want counter spells, you want hard counters, you want counterspell, cancel. You want cards like Pact of Negation, Force of Will, Mana Drain. These are all more expensive, but simply put, things like counterspell that just counter a spell flat out are the things you want to look for. If you want to remove something, you want a card like Terminate that just destroy a creature. The end. Those sort of cards are far more fitting. You don't want the unless they pay X. And so pretty much you can ignore anytime you see a card that says unless they pay X, just ignore it, because that sort of thing can't go on in your EDH deck. It'll usually just be wasteful. Another thing is small removal. In EDH, there's most of the time it's lots of big, giant monster creatures. Lots of big board impacting scale stuff. spells, you have infinite combos, all sorts of crazy, huge global effects going on. So cards like an Arc Trail, which might be good in Standard, is kind of majority of time in multiplayer useless. And though it can be useful in 1 vs 1 EDH decks, in multiplayers, a Simic Sky Swallower or an Inkwell Leviathan will just laugh off the Arc Trail. So even though if you might say early game, it's like, oh, but I can kill his Khazali Pride Mage for 2 damage with Arc Trail. It's like, yes, you can. Or you can kill his small general. But then, let's say you draw it 20 or 30 turns down, 50 turns down in your deck. Then it's kind of, by that point, it's usually useless. So you want things that are cheap removal spells that have a more powerful impact. So you have cards like Swords to Plowshares. You exile a creature. That's not limited to small stuff. You can do that to big creatures. You want cards, even things like Go for the Throat. You want to be budget. Go for the Throat, Putrefy, Mortify. Those are all very budgetary cards that just straight up remove something for very cheap. So that's kind of how you have to think about smaller removal spells. We call them spot removal. That you need to make sure that if they're filling up a spot in your deck, they have to be a useful, impactful card in the entire game. Another example is of something that you have to consider that's different between the 60 card decks and EDH, is the flexibility and use of multiple cards. This is kind of two sides of the same coin. Flexibility is that if you have a card that can do multiple things or at once or multiple things in use, those sort of cards are particularly useful. So cards like the commands, Profane Command, any of the command cards that allow you to do, you pick 2. There's 4 options, you pick 2. Any of the charms that they say pick something from a bunch of choices. Having cards that give you lots of options, flexible cards, are particularly useful in EDH. If a card has Transmute on the bottom, that's really useful because usually it does something normally, or you can transmute it to search for something. Cycling card is what you have in EDH very often. You cycle the card and you draw a card, or you just play the card normally. Kicker spells, Entwine, anything that lets you do multiple things is very useful in EDH. And kind of tying into that is the need for multiple cards. Because if, let's say in your deck, you want to have 5 removal spells in a standard deck, where, 8 removal spells. Let's say you have 4 Go for the Throats and 4 Tribute to Hungers. So you have 8 removal in the deck. In EDH, you tend to have more removal, but if you expect to be getting your removal in your hand out of an 100 card deck, the chances of getting it will be very small unless you have multiple cards that do a similar thing. So I guess we can call this useful density. So having multiple cards that do the same thing, even if they're differently named, allow you to increase your odds of getting those cards and using them. So you really want cards that allow you flexibility if you draw them, and you also want to be able to get your cards more frequently. The only way to do this is to have multiple cards with the same function. So this is a very careful balance. I may actually put a link below in the description that has a thread for probabilities of getting things and how you have to consider how many cards you're using for each one. Another thing to talk about would be synergies. Synergy, we mentioned before, it's 2 things working together that do something better than either of them could have done on their own. So, for example, if you're going to have Rafik of the Many as your general, the cards that you want to interact with him will be very different than the cards that interact with the general card gave, which is a token general. You want cards that will help the token general, and those sort of cards will often be very different than, so you might want to give Rafik 10+10 and Trample and Annihilator, whereas in Gave, you want to be able to make your creatures all have, get 20+20, all your tokens, so you can overrun someone. So putting a card that gives all your tokens plus X and makes them all really scary is more useful when synergized with Gabe's token creation,
Whereas by Rafik,
the better synergy, instead of just giving him much more powerful and harder to block, it synergizes better. So synergy is something that is absolutely crucial. When you're building your deck, the overall question should be, you have to always ask yourself, with any card in the deck, does this card have synergy with the rest of the deck and with any particular cards in the deck? Because usually if it doesn't, it probably doesn't belong there. Another thing to talk about in EDH that breaks from the norm is tutoring. In regular decks, there are tutor cards. There are things like Ponder that let you search through a couple of cards to set things up and you can draw. And there are other tutor cards that you'll see used. However, in EDH, you really need lots of tutoring because, let's use for example a combo deck. In order to set up your pieces, you're not going to have 4 of each of your pieces in the deck. So in order to get the combo pieces you need, you have to have ways to pull out the individual cards you're looking for. Tutoring lets you do that. Another important thing is if you're in trouble, someone plays a Blightsteel Colossus and you're sure that in the next 3 or 4 cards you don't have a removal spell, but you have a tutor to go get a removal spell, that tutor can go get you what you need. So tutors are something that has to be balanced into every deck. The problem with tutors is that many times they're expensive. So you have cards like Enlightened Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Eldamri's Call, Idyllic Tutor, Chords of Calling. I mean, you could list them on and on forever. Many of them are expensive. However, there are budgetary cards you can use. Trinket Mage is a classic. People use to get cheap artifact cards like Soul Ring. It's a really nice tutor. Tezzeret the Seeker is a fairly cheap artifact searching card. You have cards like Worldly Tutor, which is only, I think, $5-ish, maybe $4 or $5, that allows you to search for a creature card. So, and there are a number of tutors that are within range of budgetary stuff. And when we get to tutors in the actual deck building section, list off, maybe we'll talk about a whole bunch of different tutors, budget and non-budget. But there are tutors that work either that can work for budget or non-budget decks, and they're incredibly important. Similarly, cards that transmute are also important as tutors. You want cards that can, as part of their flexibility, tutor you something. That's something to look for in creatures. You also have cards that tutor for specific things. Unlike Demonic Tutor that searches for any card, you have a card like Fauna Shaman that'll search for a creature. Or you have a card like Weathered Wayfarer from Onslaught that'll search for lands. So balancing which tutors you need and how many of each is a very difficult task, but it can often be very rewarding to have enough tutors in your deck. And having more tutors than less is rather important, because you need to have your functional density. Also, another thing to talk about is drawing, card advantage. You want to be able to draw more than your opponent, or to draw into cards you need, hopefully at a faster pace than your opponent can. So draw spells are incredibly important. Larger draw spells that draw you 3, 4, 5 cards, like Harmonize, Tidings, Jace's Ingenuity, these are all cards that let you draw a bulk of cards in one go, are very useful. Card engines, like Phyrexian Arena, Consecrated Sphinx, Graveborn Muse, these are all cards that let you consistently draw. And in EDH, those are absolutely golden. They're used all over the place. So you want to be able to draw a lot more than your opponent. While this is true in other formats as well, that you want to be able to draw stuff, in this format, it's important to draw a lot more. You can't think about drawing one card, like a Ponder, and drawing with the one card off the Ponder is going to be helpful here. You need to draw a lot more cards in order to have advantage. You also want cards that are not draw cards, but that can help your drawing of the cards you need. So you have cards like Sensi's Divining Top or Crystal Ball is more budget for that sort of use, that allow you to look at the top cards and put them in order so that you can draw the ones you need. So an equivalent to this, if you have a card that lets you scry multiple times, is also rather useful. Card advantage is absolutely crucial in EDH, and you have to do it on a very large scale. Also, there's reusability, reusing cards. Using a card once, like a Naturalize, just destroying an artifact or something, is nice, But in EDH, why would you want to just do it once when you can use it multiple times and hopefully destroy multiple dangers to your deck? So there are plenty of abilities that are far more useful in EDH than they often are in standard 60 decks. So having cards have flashback. Flashback's becoming a new thing now, which is good in Innistrad. Flashback cards are very useful because you use them once, then you can flash them back and use them again. In EDH, being able to destroy 2 dangerous artifacts is always better than destroying 1 dangerous artifact. Cards that return permanents to their owner's hands are really good. Bouncing things back, because it forces your opponent to replay them, which wastes their mana and is just wasting of their time. They'd rather just have it in play. So returning things is also really, really nice. Also, many bounce spells can return things that you need to reuse back to your hand, and then you can replay them for another effect, which is really nice. Rebound, buyback, retrace, these sort of spells are very useful in EDH because they let you reuse cards. And in a game that's as long and as drawn out and has as many threats as EDH does, you want to ensure that you have many, many answers, more than just a one-time use card. Another important thing, removal spells. In EDH, no matter what colors you're running, no matter what type of decks you're going up against, removal is absolutely crucial. If you have an aggro deck, you'll still have removal. You always need removal because there are always things that will scare you when they hit play, and you have to be able to get rid of them. Doesn't matter what colors you're running. And you have to be able to be flexible. You need ways to handle creatures that have Shroud, Indestructibility, or any other sort of crazy evasion or danger to you. So flexible cards like Austere Command that lets you choose between destroying artifacts, enchantments, and creatures of varying power and toughness. You're not just going to have a simple 4 to 8 removal spells in your deck. Oftentimes, it'll be a good 10 to 20% of your deck will involve removal somehow. The careful balance, which we'll have to talk about, between spot removal, single or 2 removals, versus sweeper spells like Wrath of God, the balance between the two depends on the decks you're playing against and depends on the style of your deck. We'll talk more about that when we get to those in the later part of the series. So for the removal, you also want to consider, which you don't think about so much in the regular standard 60 card deck formats, is you really have to consider tucking cards that have a tuck effect, where it puts something back into their opponent's deck. So if someone attacks you with their general and you just kill it, it'll go back to the command zone. However, if you condemn it, which puts it at the bottom of the opponent's library when it attacks, then it doesn't go back to the command zone. The opponent has to go get their general somehow. Oftentimes, if they can't, it'll be at the bottom of their deck for much of the game, which is usually a good thing because you pick your commanders to be useful. So that can also work with spells that you're afraid your opponent can get back in their hand really quickly if you put in the graveyard. Someone plays something that's flashback, it's probably better to spell crumple it to put on the bottom of their deck than just to straight up counterspell it, because they'll be able to flashback it if you don't. Sacrificing is very important because you need to ensure that if someone has an indestructible creature, that you can force them to sacrifice it if you don't have the removal spells that can handle indestructible cards. So things like Diabolic Edict, Fleshbag Marauder, Smallpox, those are all good cards to force sacrificing. All is Dust is probably the most famous removal spell this way because it forces sacrificial, large sacrifice. Also, something to consider, you have cards in standard like Acidic Slime that is removal on a stick, particularly flexible removal on a stick. Acidic Slime is very popular in EDH, and there are many others like it. Being able to play a creature and have one of its utility effects is a destroy spell is awesome. There are many very, very popular removal on a stick cards. So while in standard you might run fewer of those, you might want your creatures to be more offensive and you save your removal spells in your hand to remove things. In EDH, having both on one is often very helpful. Even though they're not instant speed, it's still particularly useful to have and consider. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of adapting your thinking is evasion. If you have big creatures The idea of a power beater that's just big with trample, let's say a 9/9 trample. Whoa, that's a 9/9 trample. I bet I'll just like run right over them. But the problem is with so many removal spells flying around and with so many other large creatures, you really have to have other ways of protecting your big creatures, and you need them to be able to get past your opponent's big creatures who are blocking. So you need to have big creatures that have things like Shroud, Hexproof, a land walk, somehow to island walk, swamp walk, some way to get through your opponent's creatures that are blocking, flying, trample. Usually your big creature should have multiple abilities that protect them or give them ways of getting by your opponent's creatures. You can't just use a straight up beater card. It usually does not work in EDH. So this is a pretty broad list of differences in thinking that you have to have when you're sitting down to build EDH. And while some of them have a slight overlap in the more standard ways of playing, in EDH, there really just have to be anything that overlaps is usually taken to a broader extreme. And there are many things that are just very different. So keep these in mind as we go on to start talking about playstyles, colors, and commanders, which will be the next coming videos. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys learned a lot in this video. Click above on the left to subscribe if you want to continue following and seeing what sort of new stuff's going to be coming. On the upper right side will be the playlist where you can see all the different videos made so far, or you can just click next video and see what's coming up, or previous video to see what was put out on the bottom left. So thanks you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.